2 rivers. That's all humanity needed to invent civilization. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a strip of land that today belongs to Iraq, something rose up more than 5,000 years ago that had never existed before. Cities, written laws, calendars, mathematics, literature. The first poem in recorded history was written here. The first legal code was carved into stone here. The first human beings who looked up at the night sky and gave names to the stars lived here. Mesopotamia wasn't music, just an ancient civilization. It was the engine that switched on every civilization that came after it. And yet, it vanished. Not all at once, not in one epic battle. Not in a single night of fire and ruin. Mesopotamia went out slowly like a flame the wind chips away at piece by piece until nobody even notices it's gone until it's already too late. And the question that has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and curious minds for centuries is still the same one we're asking today. How does the very first civilization on Earth die? What has to happen for something so extraordinary, something so deeply rooted in the ground and in human memory to simply stop existing? That's what, music, we're going to find out. Picture this. You've never seen a city in your life. You were born in an age when people are always on the move, following herds, chasing water, camping under an open sky. That was life for almost every human being on the planet for tens of thousands of years. And then around the year 4000 BCE, something changes in that one corner of the world, sitting between 2 rivers. The Sumerians stop. They decide to, music, stay put. What they build next is the boldest experiment our species had ever attempted. Uruk, the first great city, eventually grew to hold more than 50,000 people. A concentration of human beings the world had never seen before. And in order for that many people to share the same space without the whole thing collapsing into chaos, they had to invent something brand new. Order. Order needed rules. Rules needed someone to write, music, them down. And that's how writing was born. Uniform pressed into wet clay tablets with a sharpened reed. The first written texts in human history weren't love poems or grand philosophical declarations. They were grain inventories, lists of barley, of oil, of livestock. Because before humanity ever wrote about love or about the gods, it wrote about wheat. Bookkeeping came before art, but art wasn't far behind. In Sumer, temples called ziggurats rose out of the flat plain like man-made mountains, stepped towers that seemed to reach for the heavens. From the top of those structures, priest astronomers built the world's first astronomical system. They mapped constellations, calculated lunar cycles, and put together a calendar that would form the backbone of every calendar that came after it. They had doctors, hydraulic engineers, judges, merchants, musicians, and they had literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written more than 4,000 years ago, tells the story of a king who searches for immortality, loses his closest friend, and travels to the very edges of the known world looking for answers about death. That story could have been written yesterday. And it wasn't just kings and poets who left something behind. Ordinary Sumerians left school exercises, complaint letters to merchants who'd sold them faulty copper, even what looked suspiciously like a joke about a dog wandering into a tavern. Reading those tablets today feels less like studying ancient history, and more like scrolling through someone else's old messages. These were people who worried about deadlines, argued with their neighbors, and grumbled about the weather, just like anyone alive right now. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe. Every week we dig into civilizations just like this one. Forgotten worlds that shaped the course of history and whose lessons still apply today. The button's right there. Now a civilization this brilliant doesn't collapse by accident. It collapses through accumulation. And the first symptoms showed up long before anyone recognized them for what they were. The first real problem Mesopotamia ever faced was something the Sumerians built with their own 2 hands. Their irrigation system. That engineering marvel that turned a dry, cracked plain into fertile farmland capable of feeding hundreds of thousands of people carried a fatal flaw that wouldn't show itself for generations. Salt. The water flowing through those canals carried dissolved minerals. When it evaporated under the blistering sun of the region, it left behind tiny deposits of salt in the soil. For years, for decades even, those deposits meant nothing at all. But over centuries of constant irrigation, the salt kept building up silently, relentlessly, one growing season at a time. The cuneiform records tell the story clearly. Around 2400 BCE, the ratio of wheat to barley planted in the southern fields was roughly even. 500 years later, wheat had all but disappeared from those same fields. Barley, far more tolerant of salty soil, was the only crop that could still survive. And by around 1700 BCE, even barley had started failing across huge stretches of farmland. In human terms, that meant exactly, music, one thing, hunger. Yields that had once fed entire cities dropped by more than half in some regions, and administrative records from the period show officials scrambling to redistribute grain from areas that were still productive to those that, music, weren't. It was a slow-motion emergency, the kind that never makes for dramatic reading in the moment, but reshapes an entire civilization over the span of a few centuries. But soil degradation was only one chapter of this story. Because while the land was breaking down slowly, the politics were catching fire fast. Mesopotamia was never a single unified state. From its earliest centuries, it was a patchwork of rival city-states, each with its own gods, its own kings, its own ambitions. And then someone came along who decided to break that balance for good. Sargon of Akkad around 2300 BCE didn't just conquer the Sumerian cities. He unified them under a single ruler. Humanity's first empire was born right there. Built by a man who understood something nobody else had figured out yet. Raw force can accomplish in a few years what diplomacy takes centuries to achieve. But empires have a fundamental problem. They're living organisms that need a constant diet of conquest and expansion to survive. Music, the moment they stop growing, they start weakening. And the moment they weaken, everyone waiting on the sidelines with old grudges sees their opening. Sargon's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf up toward the Mediterranean coast, an area larger than anything a single ruler had ever controlled before him. And for a while, it looked unstoppable. The Akkadian collapse hit around 2150 BCE. And it happened fast enough to stun the people living through it. A tablet from that period known today as the Curse of Akkad describes abandoned cities, untended fields, and trade routes gone silent. There's solid geological evidence pointing to a severe decadecile-long drought that swept through the region, pushing entire populations south and putting brutal pressure on resources that were already stretched thin. The Akkadian Empire simply couldn't hold up under that kind of weight. But here's the remarkable part. Mesopotamia didn't give up. After the Akkadians fell, Sumer went through a brief renaissance under the third dynasty of a period when art, literature, and administration reached a level of sophistication nobody had seen, music, before. Its kings declared themselves living gods and produced the Code of Uramu, the oldest known legal code in the world, predating the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. When the first great empire fell apart, Mesopotamia's answer wasn't to surrender. It was to build something even bigger. And that, as we're about to see, became part of the problem all over again. Hammurabi of Babylon deserves a chapter all his own. Around 1792 BCE, music, this king inherited a small kingdom sitting in the center of Mesopotamia. For the first 30 years of his reign, he showed almost inhuman patience, building alliances, strengthening his base, waiting for exactly the right moment. And when that moment finally arrived, he unified nearly all of Mesopotamia in under a decade. Then he did something no conqueror before him had ever attempted on that scale. He carved an exhaustive legal code of 282 laws into a stone stele more than 6 foot tall and placed it in a temple where anyone could walk up and read it for themselves. What Hammurabi understood and what his successors took far too long to learn was that an empire doesn't survive on the sword alone. It survives on institutions, on laws that ordinary people understand and accept as fair. His reign was the most stable period Babylon would know for centuries. But no glory lasts forever. And Mesopotamia, almost as if it were cursed, to repeat the same cycle over and over, fractured again after his death. What came next was a fascinating chaotic period. Mesopotamia turned into the epicenter of a power struggle between civilizations closing in from every direction. The Kassites from the east, the Assyrians from the north, the Hittites from Anatolia, the Elamites from the mountains of what's now Iran. Every single one of these peoples understood the same basic truth. Mesopotamia was the greatest prize in music, the ancient world. Whoever controlled it controlled the most important trade routes on earth, the most productive farmland anywhere, and the most sophisticated cities that existed at the time. The Assyrian Empire is perhaps the most extreme example of what happens when a civilization decides that systematic violence is its main tool of government. Their armies were war machines refined over centuries of relentless practice. They fought with iron while their enemies were still swinging bronze. They developed siege tactics that could bring down a walled city in a matter of days. And they carried out mass deportations with a bureaucratic coldness that terrified everyone who heard about it. When they conquered a people, they physically relocated them, uprooting entire populations and scattering them across other corners of the empire. It was a deliberate strategy to destroy identity and manufacture total dependence on the central authority. Assyrian kings didn't hide any of this. They boasted, music, about it. Palace walls were carved with detailed reliefs showing cities burning and captives being led away in chains. Propaganda meant to reach anyone who might be thinking about resisting. It worked, at least in the short term. But the Assyrian Empire ruled through terror, and terror is expensive to maintain. It demands a constant, unrelenting level of violence just to stay standing. The moment that military machines started to falter, the moment campaigns grew too costly and the territories grew too scattered to control, the entire structure came crashing down. And it came down fast. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Mes and Babylonians overran Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The most feared city in the ancient world, music, was destroyed so thoroughly that it took centuries before anyone rediscovered it. Ancient records describe its fall in tones that swing somewhere between shock and satisfaction. When the Assyrian Empire fell, Babylon stepped into the void it left behind. And under Nebuchadnezzar II, the city reached a level of glory it had never known before. Its double walls were so wide that 2 chariots could ride side by side along the top of them. Nearly 40 feet of solid brick and mortar. The Ishtar Gate, covered in deep, music, lapis blue tiles and decorated with relief dragons, was one of the single most spectacular structures human eyes had ever seen. And the legendary Hanging Gardens, if they truly existed, represented the civilization's ability to bend nature itself into submission. Growing terrace gardens rising nearly 80 feet into the air, right in the middle of a landscape that received only a few inches of rainfall a year. Ancient writers described irrigation systems that pulled water up from the Euphrates through a chain of screws and buckets, an engineering feat that modern historians still argue about today. Since no physical trace of the gardens has ever been confirmed, Nebuchadnezzar also destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem and deported the Judean elite to Babylon. That period, known as the Babylonian captivity, had consequences that echoed far beyond its own time. It was during that exile that the Hebrew scriptures were compiled and organized into a coherent body of texts. Without Babylon, without that trauma of forced exile, the Bible as we know it today probably wouldn't exist. The great monotheistic religions of the Western world owe Mesopotamia a debt that rarely gets acknowledged out loud. Some of the earliest surviving fragments of those compiled texts even echo phrases and imagery found in far older Mesopotamian hymns, a quiet reminder of just how tangled these ancient cultures really were. But even the brightest glory has a shelf life. The years following Nebuchadnezzar's death were years of dynastic chaos. In under 25 years, Babylon burned through 6 different kings, several of whom seized the throne through outright conspiracy. The last of them, Nabonidus, was a man with religious tastes that were unusual, to put it mildly, for someone running an empire. He tried to elevate the moon god Sin above Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. And in doing so, he alienated the powerful priesthood that had been the backbone of the state for generations. So when the threat finally came from the east, a lot of those priests decided a regime change sounded a lot better than dying to defend a king who'd spent years disrespecting them. That threat had a name: Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, the Persian king marched his army toward Babylon. And what happened next was extraordinary. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. There was no great battle, no prolonged siege, no massacre. Babylon's gates opened for the Persian army almost without a fight. The priests of Marduk, who had quietly smoothed the way for the transition, were rewarded for their cooperation. And Cyrus issued what's now known as the Cyrus Cylinder, proclaiming his respect for local gods and local traditions, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. It was almost certainly propaganda, at least in part. But the outcome was that the Persian conquest of Babylon looked nothing like anything that had come before it. And Mesopotamia, now folded into a much larger empire, just kept on functioning. The temples stayed active. The astronomers kept up their observations. The merchants kept their trade networks running. But the center of gravity of the world had shifted. And that shift, small as it seemed at the time, would carry consequences nobody could undo. After the Persians came the Macedonians. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into Babylon after crushing the Persian king at the Battle of Gamala. Like Cyrus before him, he respected the temples and local customs, and by all accounts, he even hoped to make Babylon the capital of his sprawling empire. He consulted the Babylonian astronomers, whose knowledge of the sky outpaced anything the Greeks had developed up to that point. He ordered the great temple of Marduk rebuilt. And then in 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander fell sick in Babylon and died. His plan to turn the city into the new center of the world died right along with him. What followed was the final slow process of dissolution. Alexander's successors pushed a systematic policy of Hellenization. They promoted Greek culture, founded new Greek-style cities like Susia on the Tigris, built specifically to compete with Babylon and pull its population away. Greek gradually replaced Tedian in administration and daily business. If you wanted to rise through the new social order, you needed to master Greek culture, not the old Mesopotamian traditions. Babylon started bleeding people. Its temples fell into disrepair. Its priests and astronomers, the keepers of centuries of accumulated knowledge, grew old without finding enough successors willing to learn ununiform. And here's the detail that ties this whole story together. There's a clay tablet housed in the British Museum that specialists refer to as the last securely dated form tablet ever written. It was inscribed in 75 CE, more than 3 centuries after Alexander's death. By that point, cuneiform was already a dying script, kept alive by a handful of priests in the last few active temples scattered across the Mesopotamian plain. By that point, the temples that still trained scribes in the old script could probably be counted on one hand, tucked away in a handful of cities where a shrinking circle of priests kept the tradition alive, mostly out of devotion rather than any practical need. Whoever wrote that final tablet almost certainly knew they were one of the last guardians of a body of knowledge on the verge of vanishing forever. And what they chose to record of all things was an astronomical observation. The Babylonians were still watching the sky right up to the very end. When that unnamed man pressed the last ununiform signs into wet clay, he brought 5,000 years of continuous writing to a close. 5,000 years of recorded history. 5,000 years of knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. Starting with grain inventories and ending with astronomical calculations so precise that Europe wouldn't match them again until the Renaissance. After that tablet, silence. The civilization that invented writing had to be rediscovered through its own words. Thousands of cuneiform tablets survived intact, buried under the rubble of destroyed cities. Because fragile as clay looks, it doesn't burn like papyrus and it doesn't rot like parchment. That's how in 1872 the modern world rediscovered the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's how we, music, came to know the code of Hammurabi, hymns to long-forgotten gods, and personal letters written by people who lived and loved and suffered 4,000 years ago in cities nobody remembered anymore. So, what did Mesopotamia actually leave behind for the world we live in? A lot more than most people realize. Our entire system of timekeeping, an hour split into 60 minutes, a minute split into 60 seconds, comes straight, music, from the Babylonian number system. A circle has 360 degrees because the Babylonians used that same, music, system for their calculations of the sky. The zodiac and its 12 signs came out of Babylon. The Greek astronomer Ptolemy relied on centuries of Babylonian sky observations to calibrate his own models of the universe. Without that patiently accumulated data, the entire trajectory of Western astronomy would look completely different today. Even the 7-day week has roots here tied to Babylonian observations of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. Each one eventually linked to a day of its own. Music, the legal tradition that started with the Code of Ornament and grew through the Code of Hammurabi, was the first systematic statement of a principle we now take for granted, that laws should be written down public and known to everyone rather than handed out arbitrarily by whoever happens to hold power. That principle, the very foundation of the rule of law as we understand it today, is more than 4,000 years old. Legal scholars still study Hammurabi's stele not as a historical curiosity, but as one of the earliest working blueprints for how a society organizes justice on paper, instead of leaving it to the whims of whoever happens to be in charge that year. The next time you glance at a clock, think about a Babylonian priest standing on top of a temple 3,000 years ago, staring up at the night sky, tracing symbols into wet clay, trying to make sense of the movement of the stars. He had no idea he was building something that would outlive his own world, his own language, his own religion, his entire civilization. But he did it anyway. Mesopotamia didn't disappear without a trace. Music, it dissolved. It transformed. It seeped into classical Islam, into Judaism, into Christianity, into the Greek philosophy that owed so much to Babylonian scholars. Its gods stopped being worshipped, but their stories survived in forms we barely recognize today. The flood of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood of Noah in the Book of Genesis are, according to many scholars, variations on the exact same ancient, music, story. The first civilization on Earth didn't vanish. It became us. If you liked this video, subscribe. We drop videos like this all the time. There's another forgotten empire waiting for you next week.